accurate the expected revenue, that means that your forecasted demand is also more accurate as well. So these are two graphs that essentially explain what expected marginal room revenue is. And it essentially relies on the fact that the probability of selling a room decreases as you sell more rooms. In other words, you have a 100% chance of selling one room. However, if you have 300 rooms, you have a very low probability to sell your 299th room, right? So your marginal expected revenue for each room that you sell declines. So you can see it in this curve here on the bottom right. You actually see that the curve goes down eventually, so that your expected marginal room revenue goes down, right? And that's if you have one rate. So essentially, the harder it is to sell, the more it increases the chance of having to give a discount. So the exact shape of the curve is determined by the probability of achieving each level of demand. So, for example, if the rate of your hotel is at $100, right? Imagine the bar rate is at $100. Your first room, you're probably going to be able to sell at $100, right? And so imagine your discount in this example is $75. So rooms should be reserved for those in the $100 rate class until the probability of selling one more room drops below 75%. In other words, your expected marginal room revenue, as long as the probability is high enough, you can sell at a given rate class. So again, if, for example, you are selling your first room and your rate is 100, well, your probability is 100%, so it's 100 times the rate of 100, so that means your expected revenue is 100. If your probability of selling the room is 90%, for instance, you will have an expected marginal room revenue of $90. And so you will keep at the same rate until the probability times the rate. So, the probability of selling the room times the rate goes below the discounted rate. In other words, if your probability to sell a room is at 75%, well, you multiply the probability 75% times the rate, you will get an expected revenue of 75. However, if your probability to sell is at 74, well, your expected marginal revenue will be $74. And so in this case, if, for example, the percentage drops for every one room you have, so for every room you sell, the percentage drops by 1%, well, on the 26th room, you're better off selling it at a discounted rate as opposed to selling it at $100 because you're better off selling it at a discounted rate as you'll get more revenue. So we will see an example on this slide looking at essentially what a protection level is. However, I'd just like to make a quick recap on what the point of indifference is. So you can see on the slide on the bottom right that the point of indifference is when the full rate, you can see here a visual representation. Here you have the full rate of $100. Eventually, it goes down below the discounted rate. Well, in this case, it's 70, but imagine it's 75. You'll see that eventually the curve drops below. So here, especially in this place, you're much better off selling at a discounted rate as you're expected to make more. This slide here shows, again, 2 points of indifference and also gives allusion to the necessary protection level, which we'll talk about later. But here we look at, say, for example, your hotel now has 3 rates. Right? It's more realistic because it's rare for one hotel to have one rate across the board. So here you're looking at allocating your capacity for each rate according to the probability. Now, the probability can be dependent on the forecasted demand, for example, right? If you forecast very high demand, the probability of selling rooms is probably going to be significantly higher than if you forecast very low demand, right? So here you actually have 2 intersects with the 3 rates. So here, if you look at the first rate, eventually the probability will go down below, and so your expected marginal room revenue goes below the mark of $180. So that means that around, I would say here in this graph, it's about 12. So after about 12 rooms, you are better off selling at the second rate, or $180, because if you multiply the rate by the probability, it's less than if you just sell it at this rate. And again, the same principle for the third rate. So you always take the class or the curve that's above the highest marginal expected revenue. It's also important that we need to understand the minimum allocation principle. So essentially, for the very high rates, you want to have a minimum allocation. So you tell yourself in this example here, you want to sell at minimum 12 rooms, but you never set a maximum rate for a high, maximum allocation for a high rate. You only do that for the low rate. So here, 12 rooms you reserve for $220 a night. The second rate, well, it's the difference here, right? So it's about 25 minus 12. So here it's about 13. So 13 rooms will be sold at $180. And afterwards, in accordance to the probability, you're better off selling it at $150. But here at $150, you've got a cap of 75 rooms. So from here to there, you've got a cap of 75 rooms. So you must remember that for a minimum rate, you have a maximum allocation. However, for the very high rates, you only have a minimum allocation. The reason for that is, well, you want to sell at minimum 12 rooms at $220. But if you sell 15 rooms, which is above your limit or your minimum, you're better off, right? Because you're selling rooms at a higher rate. So it's more advantageous for you. But however, if you're looking at the lower rates, you put a maximum, because eventually you don't really want to waste all this, potential revenue that you have. So ideally, best case scenario, your highest rate, you sell 100% of it. However, it's not really realistic, so you have the different rates. But again, for the very low rates, it's always important to have a limit, a maximum, and for the high rates, have a minimum. So a nested reservation system, a nested booking control policy, essentially allows more valuable products to access the capacity reserved for less valuable products. Well, essentially, the graph or the little image on the bottom right will provide a more visual representation of that. But essentially, you have a minimum allocation for a given level. So here, for example, assume that there are 100 identical rooms in a hotel, and your transient customers, they pay 4 times as more on average, 4 times more than the government. The groups pay twice more as the government, and the corporate pay 3 times as the government. So here, if you have a nested protection level, well, here you can see you've got 100 rooms for all segments. Then you look at trying to reserve a certain amount of rooms for a given segment. So here you've got 40 rooms for the transient, and the rest is given or reserved for the other segments, because obviously you need to be open to every type of guest segments, right? Groups, for example, they often bring a lot of ancillary revenue, so you want to keep the door open to them as well. So here you can see the nested protection level essentially looks at grouping different segments together and imposing a limit on how much you can sell. So rate mix control. So the objective is to determine how many rooms to protect for each rate class. It aims at saving rooms for the most expensive rate classes designed for last booking guests and make them available at the end of the booking period shortly before arrival. So again, this is done by limiting the availability in low rate classes, right? Imposing a maximum allocation as opposed to a minimum, so that you can attract those who have a higher willingness to pay, so that you can end up bringing more revenue, right? And a nested protection level is a minimum room capacity a hotel protects for a given class. So you want at least X amount of rooms to be sold for a given segment. The sell-up is the process by which a guest whose first choice class isn't available decides to pay more for a higher available class. So say, for instance, you're willing to buy a room for $200, right? And you are looking to be you kind of have a tight budget, and you want to purchase a room for $150. But however, assume that the hotel has sold all the rate classes at $150, and the next available rate class is $175. Well, as long as it's below the guest's willingness to pay, you can make a sale. And that is beneficial for you because you actually end up gaining more revenue, right? As opposed to paying $150, the guest pays $175. So you actually end up getting more revenue. So it's useful to attempt to benefit from this sell-up by having imposing limits on certain rate classes. The basic assumptions for Chapter 7 are that the reservations for the lowest rate come in earlier than those for the higher ones, right? People tend to book very early to get the lowest rates, and those who end up booking last minute tend to have higher rates. Demand for each class is independent. So each class, each rate class is independent. And we'll see an Excel example of that later on. The initial capacity allocation is carried out long before the arrival date. So again, this is using historical data, and it's a forecast really. The main challenges are the dynamics of demand elasticity. Remember that some people can be very, very sensitive to price. So you must understand that small changes in price could turn away some guests. Actual sales dynamics versus forecast timing. So obviously, if you forecast for 2 months ahead, the actual sales might differ. There might be an event, there might be something happening, there might be an external factor that affects the actual results compared to the forecast. You have the application of probabilities. It's difficult to oftentimes come up with them. You can look at the forecasted demand, but again, how can you accurately forecast or put the probability? You never can. It's never as accurate. It's never precise 100%. It's an estimation. So that's the little challenge there. You might have a certain forecast, which may be far from the reality. You have the length of stay and ancillary revenue effects, because obviously, it's you have to think, if a guest pays $200 for a room but stays 1 night, and another pays half the rate but stays 3 nights, well, who's more profitable? The person who ends up bringing more for your company, especially if the room is empty. And you also have to look at the marginal cost considerations as well. Just a quick thing, I'm going to show you a little Excel document just so you can see a more visual example. Hang on, let me just share my Excel doc. All right, so here, for example, this is just the basics on the EMRR. So here, for example, you look at the cumulative probability. So by doing that, you just do the norm dist. I hope everyone can see my screen, but it actually says on the bottom. So here you can see that as you're selling more rooms, the marginal probability of selling it actually decreases. So this goes to prove what the graph was showing before. And here you see that, again, if you were to sell the room at $100, the rates that you're probably going to get is only 30, right? So you may as well change rate class as opposed to keeping the same rate. And so to give a more visual example, here is an example with more than one rate. So originally, here at $200, you have a nested protection level of 20, right? And you're saying that's okay, 20 rooms I'm going to sell at $200. Well, if you look at the different rates, you actually see that there's a negative difference. And this negative difference is, you don't want to have a negative difference. You want to have a zero difference like there, right? So here what it's telling you is that at 20 rooms, if you multiply the probability times the rate, your expected revenue is $100, okay? So if you're going to sell your 20th room at $200, the expected revenue you receive is only $100. However, if you sell the room on the same probability, if you sell the room on the same probability with a different rate class, you actually end up making more money. Therefore, the 20th room should be sold at a lower rate class, because you're not going to, the probability of getting it at the higher rate class, it turns out you end up making less theoretically. So you're better off changing your rate to $150 as opposed to $200, as you end up making more money. So here you'll see that in reality, you're better off selling only 18 rooms as opposed to 20 rooms at $200, because you actually end up making more money, and it's more profitable for you in the long run. So just a little example there to be able to probably give you a visual representation of that. Let me just share my presentation again. Awesome. Okay, so moving on to Chapter 7. So Chapter 7 is linear programming and bid pricing, and I'll also go through an Excel example to give a visual representation of what it looks like. But essentially, linear programming, or the constrained optimization technique, in other words, is the mathematical modeling technique to determine the optimum allocation of scarce resources among competing demands, right? Because we must understand that scarce resources are finite. We have a limited amount of them. So we must we aim to maximize or minimize something with the requirements that we have, right? So the whole point of it is to see, do we want to maximize revenue? Do we want to maximize profit? Do we want to minimize travel time? Do you want to minimize distance traveled? So there's a lot of different things you can use, and you have to apply these constraints to be able to make it more realistic. So, of course, you have the main problems being the product mix, the blending, and actually revenue management in itself, right? How to allocate things the correct way. So looking at the main 4 words that we need to know for Excel specifically, we have decision variables, which are essentially what you want to have done. Like, what do you want to do? Do you want to maximize something, or do you want to minimize something, right? That's the first thing you should think of. After you've decided that, you have to look at your objective function, right? Which is essentially the function of the decision variable. It's actually, in other words, if you want to maximize something, okay, what do you want to maximize? Do you want to maximize revenue? Do you want to maximize profit? Do you want to maximize efficiency? What exactly is it you want to maximize? And that's what the objective function is. The constraints, well, these are the limits that you have, right? Your scarce resources. In a hotel, it could be, for example, the amount of rooms you have. For an airline, it could be the amount of aircraft you have, right? You have a limited amount of numbers. Otherwise, if you didn't, we can make infinite revenue, and that's not realistic, right? And the last consideration or point that we need to look at is the non-negativity constraint, right? We have to look at the non-negative values and the integrity condition. So in essence, no negative values, well, you can't really sell -1 of a room, or you can't produce -1 of a car, right? All your values have to be positive. And the integrity condition is essentially if you're looking at it from revenue management or for a hotel perspective, you can't sell 0.1 of a room or 0.5 of a room. The integrity condition essentially means that you need to sell a whole number of something, right? You can't sell half a car or half a phone or 0.7 of a room, right? So it should be, in essence, a whole number. The main additional points is that the relationship among the decision variables must be linear, hence why it's called linear programming. If it's not linear, then you can't apply these functions to it. A model must have an objective function, right? You must have something you want to maximize or minimize. Resource constraints are essential because obviously resources are finite. Again, you don't have an unlimited amount of resources. You don't have an unlimited amount of rooms. And obviously, there must be a non-negative constraint. Otherwise, it makes no sense to sell minus rooms. All right. So, bid pricing approach. So the bid pricing approach provides a simple method to determine which rate class to open or close. If this doesn't make sense, I will show an Excel example to make it a lot easier, and maybe it'll make it a bit better to understand. So essentially, the revenue management system computes a control price known as the bid price, right? The opportunity cost of selling or using one additional unit of the resource. The shadow price is essentially is associated with a resource, and it tells you how much it would be worth to weaken each of the capacity constraints by 1 unit. So again, it tells you how much more revenue you would get by increasing the amount of that resource by 1 unit. So if you increase 1 additional room, how much money you're going to get. Bid prices are essentially threshold values defined for resources. So certain values that if you surpass, then you have to change, right? And they are used to approximate the opportunity cost of using 1 unit of capacity on the resource. If this doesn't make sense, I will again show it on Excel to make it a bit clearer. So essentially, the bid price for a given date is interpreted as the marginal revenue the hotel would receive if it were to increase its capacity on that date for 1 more room. Again, it's the minimum acceptable revenue for a unit of capacity. If the hotel is not forecasted to sell out, the bid price is equal to 0, right? Since an increase in capacity does not generate more revenue, right? If you have 90% occupancy, your bid price would be 0, because if you have 101 rooms, you still don't have it sold, right? So in this case, all rate classes would be open if you're not forecasted to sell out, because, well, if the forecast of demand, if you don't sell out, well, you're better off making some revenue rather than nothing, right? So when the forecast of demand is exceeding the capacity, the bid price is greater than 0. So that means that the lower rate classes will close. For multiple night stays, a typical approach is to average the bid prices. So I'll show an example of that for the dates involved, because again, bid price and shadow price, this is something that must be cleared up straight away. The bid price and the shadow price are the same thing for one LOS. In other words, if you're looking at the airline industry, for example, the bid price is equal to the shadow price. The reason being, in an airplane, you don't have the constraint of the LOS. Right? In a hotel, you can stay more than one night. So therefore, your bid price will not be the same as the shadow price. I hope that makes sense. We'll see an Excel example. And again, bid prices must be updated after each sale because it has to be dynamic, right? You're looking at how full or how you're going to forecast to be sold out. So your bid price has to constantly change so that you can keep it updated. So just to give you guys a bit of a visual example, I will show you an Excel document to provide a little bit of insight. Give me a second. All right, so if you're looking at the linear programming, again, here's an example of how it works. So essentially, here is your unconstrained demand. This is a very simple way of doing it, but this is your unconstrained demand. You have 4 different rate classes, and you're essentially looking at, well, I want to maximize revenue. How do I maximize revenue? Yada, yada, yada. So again, another example here and another example here. But the most important one is obviously the revenue optimization, right? And here is where you're looking at using the shadow price and the bid price. I know it looks a bit like a math problem, but it's rather simple. So how would you be able to approach this? Well, your capacity is 100, and this is your unconstrained demand. Okay, so let us just copy and paste this into this corner. Okay, this is your unconstrained demand. So how would you approach this to look at how to maximize revenue? Well, if you were asked to maximize revenue, you would first look at, you have to first compute the daily revenue, right? So first what you would do is rooms occupied, and then you would do daily revenue, and then you'd look at the rooms occupied. So obviously you take the sum of this, and then obviously for the multiple night stays, you take the sum up of all that, like this, like so. Hang on. Right. So, anyway, so that's how you would do it for the room occupancy. So assume that in this case, you've got all the rooms occupied summed up, and then you look at computing your daily revenue. So your daily revenue would be computed by taking the sum products. So you take the LOS multiplied by the rate class multiplied by the unconstrained demand. Remember that you must block the these two cells here. So in this example, if you look here, I have actually blocked the first two rows because the LOS has to stay the same, the rates stay the same. It's just the daily demand that changes, right? So you must have this that changes, that fluctuates. Okay, so once you've done that, well, you have to use the solver function. So how would you use the solver function? You'd go on data, you'd go on solver, and assume that this is all blank. Assume all the parameters are all blank. How would you do it? Well, your objective function is what? What is your objective function? Well, you're aiming to maximize revenue, right? So your objective function would be the sum of revenue, okay? And what do you aim to do? Well, you aim to maximize it. You can min, you can find the value of, but in this case, we're maximizing it. What variable cells are we changing? So these are essentially what are the values that will change. So essentially, your variable cells would be this. Okay, this is essentially what these are the numbers that will fluctuate in accordance to which room category you sell to make the most revenue. Then you have your constraints. Okay, now assume the constraints are both deleted. So your first constraint will be that the rooms occupied cannot exceed your capacity, right? Because you cannot sell more than 100 rooms. If you have 101 more rooms sold, well, it's not possible. You don't have 100 rooms. Okay. So that's your first constraint. Then your second constraint would be that this cannot exceed unconstrained demand, right? The reason for that is, well, you've got a given demand on the market. You can't allocate more rooms than what the demand has, because if there's no demand, what's the reason of allocating a room to that segment, right? So that would be the second constraint, and that's the only two you need. In this example, those are the only two that you need. And once you click solve, eventually you have this, and then you have the option to do a sensitivity report. which will help you do the bid pricing. So the sensitivity report essentially gives you, I have it on the slide as well, so I'm not going to click that. It takes a bit of time on my computer to load up. But once you do that, you'll have a value. And this 263,868 is the maximum amount of revenue I can make if I were to sell each of these rooms at these quantities in relation to the unconstrained demand. So you can see that here there's 0 rooms sold because there is no demand, and so on and so forth. And it never exceeds the it never actually exceeds the unconstrained demand. So here you can see an example. The maximum unconstrained demand for LOS2 is at 3. So there's 3 people that you have that are demanding the rate class of $109. And here the maximum bid price that you can, or the maximum that you will allocate is 3, right? So you do not allocate something that exceeds the unconstrained demand. Once you click sensitivity report, it will open into a new sheet and you essentially get all this. Now, this is not very useful. The only bit that is useful is this column down here, which is the shadow price. All right, now the shadow price is essentially going, the shadow price is essentially going to tell you how much, which is what you're going to use for an LOS1. So, right, so here you would use, you just copy and paste these values for each day, right? There's a shadow price for each given day, hence why it's for LOS1. And assume now you put your shadow prices, I just pasted them here, okay? So I just took this, to do this example, I took these values from the shadow price on the sensitivity report. When you click on it, and you'll see that the values that I have are completely identical. So here, that is your shadow price for LOS1, okay? Let me just clear this. So how do you find the bid price for LOS2? Well, the bid price for LOS2 would be the average, right? You take the average. So this is how it works. It's not necessarily the shadow price anymore. It's the bid price. And this is your threshold, okay? The threshold that you have to allocate rooms at a given length of stay. Okay, hang on. Apparently I have questions on here. Okay, let me just see the questions. Okay, yeah, so the shadow price is, if you're theoretically, to answer your question, Rohit, theoretically the shadow price is the same as the bid price. However, it doesn't necessarily apply to the hotel industry because you have length of stay. If you're looking at the airline industry, the shadow price is the bid price, because in the airline industry on an airplane, you don't have this issue of length of stay. However, here, because you've got a length of stay of 2 or 3 or 4, you take an average of the bid price, or the shadow price in this case. All right. 1 second. What is, Sebastian? Why do we not add integer or something for the solver? What do you mean by integer or something? Essentially, what the solver does is that it knows that it's not. It knows that it's not supposed to be a negativity constraint as long as you say that all the values are it does it automatically. At least on my screen, it does it automatically. So if there's an issue with that, let me know and I can see if I can try to fix that. So going back to the Excel, all right, so I've just taken the sensitivity reports that you have here, and I've taken the shadow price, and I've looked at it, and I've put it as LOS1. So to answer Rohit's question again, the shadow price is the bid price for LOS1, okay? Because you're essentially given a shadow price for every day, okay? However, for LOS2, or if you're staying 2 days, well, you're not just, because the demand fluctuates day by day, you have to take an average, right? So here you take an average. You take an average of the first 2, and for LOS3, you take an average of the first 3, all right? And how do you use these thresholds? Well, assume you've got LOS3, or 3 lengths of stays for 3 different rate classes. All right, so you've got 109, you've got 159, and you have 209. So if you look on the 19th of October, well, the bid price for all 3 lengths of stay is 109. So a rule of thumb is if the shadow price or the bid price is greater than the number of the value of the class, you have to close it. If the shadow price is below, you keep it open. In other words, the shadow price is the marginal value of selling another room. Like if you have an increase in capacity by 1, that is the marginal value that you have. In other words, this is how much it's worth. A room on the 19th is worth $109. So, of course, you would sell it for a minimum of 109. If you sell it for more, great. But if you sell it for exactly 109, you're not making a loss, right? It's the same principle for the 20th, but then on the 21st, you see that for LOS 3, your bid price is at 126. So now that you see the bid price is greater than the allocation, the rate allocation, or the rate class, here you would close. The reason being that on a length of stay of 3, your room is worth $126. The value is 126. Why would you sell it at a value lower than what it's supposed to be? You know what I mean? So in other words, because the value is at 126, why would you sell it at 109? So you'd actually close this rate class because, well, if people want to stay 3 nights, they actually have to end up paying more because it's worth 126. Another example on the 22nd here, the shadow price is, again, for LOS 1 is at 109, so you keep the rate class open. For LOS 2, the rate class is at 134. So the 134, the bid price is greater than the rate class. So because the bid price is greater than the rate class, you close the rate for LOS 2. And the same principle for LOS 3. All right, so we can see a same principle here again. The bid price for all 3 actually exceeds 109. So for LOS 1, 2, and for LOS 3, it's greater than 109. So you'd close the rate class of 109 in general, because why would you sell for less than what it's worth? So you'd keep the other ones open because that's how you'd make the money. And then if you're looking at the bar rates, well, the bar rates tell you what's the minimum amount that you should, that the minimum best available rates. So on the 24th, right here, on your best available rate is 159. Because you cannot sell a room for less than that. On the 25th, your best available rate for LOS 1 is 159. Again, because there is no room that is going to bring you any less than that. So you'd sell minimum for what it's worth. I hope that makes sense for bid pricing, and it adds a little bit. So it looks complicated, but in essence, it is rather easy when it's explained carefully. So here on the 26th, you would have CTA, closed to arrival. Well, because at 109, the rate class of 109, well, for all of it, it's closed. It's always going to pass. So $109 closed completely. It's close to arrival. So you're not going to open the $109 rate class at all, because in any length of stay, your room's value exceeds it. So that's why you'd have that. And then here you'd have minimum 2 nights, because at 159, you have an LOS minimum of 2. If you sell any lower, you end up not making as much money as it's worth. All right, so back to the presentation. I hope I'm not going too fast. Thank you for letting me know I'm a bit fast. I tend to rush through things. So moving on, we have chapter 8, which is distribution channel management. Now, distribution channel management, well, for hotels, especially the small ones, an intermediary can offer a route to the market, right? If you have an intermediary is essentially an entity that acts as a communication between buyers and sellers who do not want to deal directly. So if you don't want to book at a hotel directly, you go through an intermediary to make the booking for you, right? And intermediaries, well, they're well known. So a lot of small budget companies can use intermediaries to encourage more bookings. The main challenge is to coordinate reservations from different channels, right? Because if you have more than one channel, you have to coordinate reservations from each one. And on top of that, you have to select which rates to apply and allocate optimal numbers, right? You have to determine how many rooms am I going to give to Booking.com? How many rooms am I going to give to Expedia, right? What rate am I going to put on Booking? What rate am I going to put on Expedia, right? So it's a lot of things to consider in order to optimize the revenue that you have. So not only with intermediary, you don't actually have to only consider the transaction cost, but you must also trigger the costs. you must also consider the cost to trigger the reservation, right? And here on the bottom, you have an example of how things work normally. If you go through a tour operator, the tour operator communicates the hotel, which the hotel comes back to you. So that's an example of an intermediary, right? Otherwise, you can look at direct channels, or you can look at OTAs as well. So rate parity. So rate parity is essentially a legal agreement between a hotel and an OTA to provide the same rates for the same room on all channels. Essentially what it does is that if you sell a room to an OTA, or an OTA is selling your room online, you do not undercut them by having a lower rate, right? It's preventing you from removing them from the market. So in order to keep it even with everybody, you have the same rate. Quick side note, I mean, it's not like we're going to be asked this question, but little thing with currencies, especially if you're purchasing something in a given currency and you're using your own, say, for example, you're buying something in America and you're using Swiss francs, currencies are something that companies have to take into consideration, because if the currencies change, well, the rate on one site and the rate on the hotel may be slightly different. So you got to be careful with that. But it's not like it's a thing that's going to be on the exam, so it's just food for thought. Channel Manager provides a dashboard allowing a property's reservation department to do updates and control all booking information. The main function of this tool is to connect rates, availability, and more details to all the connected online channels, things such as Agoda, Expedia, and Booking.com. These data updates are automatically shared and synchronized among all channels. So that essentially means if a room is sold on Expedia, well, minus one room will be appearing on Agoda and Booking.com, right? So it's dynamic, and so there's not availability when there isn't in reality. So again, it connects rates and availability to all channels, and here we have just an example of how it all works, but it's just a visual representation. But again, it's a channel manager looks at it's essentially just providing all the information so that everybody is on the same page. A bit of vocab. So CRS, or a central reservation system, is a structure used to accept hotel guests' reservations and communicate them to an individual hotel's property management system. So essentially, it goes from the central reservation system gets a booking, it sends that booking or that to the property management system, and it appears on your screen in a given hotel. The GDS is a group of companies that electronically connect travel-related businesses, such as airlines or hotels, with those individuals and companies seeking to buy from them. So it's essentially a connection that you have between the hotel and the leisure or the business traveler. And so IDS is very similar, except you're using internet, not a company. A GDS, for example, an example of the GDS would be Sabre, Amadeus, or Travelport. Those are companies that are supposed to connect the information. IDS is all done on the internet. So things like Google, where everything is dynamic and you have the rate availabilities changed and updated regularly. Looking at some distribution channels, well, the first one we have are property websites or social media pages like Facebook or Instagram, if you can book hotels on Instagram. So essentially, it's a web address whose content is 100% controlled by a hotel management team. So if it's a property site like Hilton.com, it's controlled by Hilton. You have minimal fees for transaction because it's your website, you're running it, not somebody else. You don't pay a commission. You don't have to pay a certain fixed rate for every room sold. So you organize it, so you have a minimum transaction fee. You have rapid modification because it's your hotel, so you can make news when it comes, so you can quickly make changes as fast as you'd like. And you can measure the effectiveness. If you look at your website, you can see how many people visit your website, how many people make a booking to your website. So you can actually look at how effective that distribution channel is. There are also referral sites or meta search engines. So they are sites that search other sites for the lowest prices and presents them. They're also known as scraping or meta search sites, and examples of that would be Kayak and Travelzoo. So they essentially take the lowest rates across the board and present them in front of you, so you can see which hotel or which rate is most convenient for you. Then you have the travel wholesaler, which is essentially a large volume travel industry intermediary who sells to other smaller volume travel intermediaries. Biggest example of that is the American Society of Travel Agents, who members pay 10% of commission on. It's not as popular as things like the merchant or the opaque model. The merchant model is where an intermediary attains rooms at a wholesale rate and then acts as a merchant by selling rooms to buyers at retail rates. So an example of this would be Hotels.com or Expedia. And what those companies do is that they essentially, merchants, they buy a hotel room at wholesale rate, which is generally 20 to 35% below the retail rate. So I don't know, Expedia goes to a Pullman hotel and says, I want to buy 10 rooms at below retail rate. And what they actually do is that the intermediary can decide what to charge. So they purchase the room for less than what it's going to be sold for, and they decide the rate. And the intermediary generally handles very high volume, so that's why it's generally applicable for large hotels. So you sell your room to somebody else, and it's actually beneficial because once you sell your room to a merchant, well, if no one reserves through the merchant, you have still sold your room. You have made some money, right? If you don't sell your rooms to a merchant and end up having no occupancy, well, you've lost a lot of money. The opaque model is a system in which the room buyer does not know the name of the hotel until they have committed to the purchase price of the room. Now, opaque models, especially for high-end hotels, is sort of a last resort. Essentially, it's anonymous. So you bid on rooms, you give your requirements, what you want, and if you win a bid, you still don't know where you're going. You know the location roughly. If you say you want a hotel in Madrid, you'll get a hotel in Madrid, but you don't know which one. Reservations are generally non-refundable, and you only get to know where you're staying after you've made the payment. A lot of companies keep anonymity because if a company or a hotel needs to sell rooms, they have to sell for better to sell for lower than nothing, right? So they go on an opaque model, but they hide their name because they don't want to tarnish their reputation. If you see a 4-star hotel selling a room for 75 francs, you're going to think something's wrong, right? So in order to avoid that, they hide their name, and it's actually beneficial for the customer because they think they're getting a better deal out of it. All right, so essentially, quick little table between the difference on the difference between agency models and the merchant models. So here you have the OTA in a merchant model. You have the OTA that decides the channel price. Remember, a merchant model, the OTA or the Expedia or Hotels.com purchases the rooms from the hotel, and they decide the price. In the agency model, well, the hotel decides the price, and then they are able to distribute that price to everyone else so that everyone's on the same page, right? So OTA in the merchant model, again, OTA purchases a number of rooms, whereas on the agency model, OTAs, a hotel decides the allocation and controls the price. So this would be agency models where you'd have rate parity. Moving on to net ADR yield. Now, essentially, net ADR yield is the percentage of the normal or standard room rate that is realized after removing selling price and cost of fees and assessments associated with specific distribution channel responsible for room sales. In other words, in order to calculate the net room rate, well, you just take the net room rate is equal to the standard ADR minus the distribution costs. I know I put the divide there, there's a typo there, so my apologies for that. So the net room rate is the standard ADR minus the channel distribution costs. And to get the net ADR yield, it's the net room rate divided by the standard ADR. Okay, so net room rate divided by standard ADR is equal to the net ADR yield. So here you can see on the bottom right, you can see an example of two hotels where the first one, Hotel A, they both have the same rate, but Hotel B has more selling costs, and therefore, because they have more selling costs, have a lower ADR yield. And having a lower ADR yield means that they end up making less total revenue on average. They end up making 16,000 as opposed to 19,000. So that goes to show that you want to try to maximize net ADR yield, and so you want to try to avoid the very, very expensive distribution channels because, well, if you use more cheaper ones, you end up making more revenue in the long run, right? So if you want to pay a high commission, well, Ideally you don't want to pay a high commission because that's a lot of money wasted, and hopefully you want to save the money you can there. So again, looking at the main factors that affect the ADR yield. So here on the right, you have a little example of it. So you have the commissions, you have the distribution fees, you have the franchise fees. If you're on a central reservation system, you have to pay the fees there. You have the global distribution system fees. You've got the internet distribution fees. And here on the bottom right, you have a table that gives you the main costs that would affect each channel. So if it's a direct reservation, you have labor costs, you have transaction fees, you have loyalty fees, you have credit card fees very often, OTAs have commissions. So whichever one brings the highest cost, you want to try to avoid using as much because, well, ideally you want to make the most money, right? Now, moving on to these main 5 points. So the distribution channel intelligence. So in this part, you have 5 main bullet points. So you have the commission rate, right? Essentially, commission rate is how many visitors make a booking. Ideally, you want to have a very, very high commission rate, right? Because, well, the commission rate is essentially, not commission rate, conversion rate. Sorry, I misspelled that. Conversion rate, is essentially what percentage of people that are visiting your website make a booking. So the formula to find the conversion rate, I'll just edit that commission rate. That was a typo on my behalf. Sorry. You take the number of bookings that you have on your direct channel, and you divide them by the unique number of monthly visitors. Why unique? Well, very often, if you visit the same website 3 times, it shouldn't be counted as 3 times because you end up making a booking, and you don't want it to be counted more than once, right? So you look at individual people. If they've logged in once, what is the percentage of them making a booking? Ideally, you want to make the most of that. So again, it's number of bookings divided by unique monthly visitors. Next, you have customer engagement time, which is essentially how long they spend on your website. You want to try to increase that as well because you want to keep a customer engaged. If they're more engaged, they have a higher tendency to book. So you want to look at trying to engage them the most possible. You have to also look at abandonment. So abandonment is how many people end up, or how many customers, or the percentage of customers that leave the page. So, for example, a stat has shown that more than 50% of travel searches are abandoned. So you look on a website, you have a look, you end up closing the tab, and you're done. 50% of people do that. A further 26% opt out when they're asked for personal details. And 21% are abandoned when they're asked for payment details. So it goes to show that there's a lot of people who, upon visiting a website, abandon it. So a lot of hotels need to look at what they can do to decrease that number. How can they get customers more engaged? Additionally, it's important to look at traffic patterns. So when people visit the most, is it a time of day? Is it a day of week? Is it a specific season? And also look at booking patterns, right? So booking patterns, very similar to traffic patterns. Here is when do people have a highest tendency to book? Booking patterns is, do people book most on a Friday? Do they book on a Saturday? And this, by doing this, you can look to change your rates accordingly, because if you know there's a lot of demand, you can aim to make additional revenue there. So factors to consider when evaluating costs and benefits by channel. Well, you've got the commission costs, right? You want to try to decrease the commissions that you pay. You have variable marketing and reservation fees by channel. So again, you have, for every reservation you make, certain channels require a fixed amount or percentage. You have to look at ancillary spend analysis, right? Which channel brings you the most ancillary revenue? Because that's also an important consideration to have. Lifetime value analysis, which guest brings you the most in the long run, like which one has the most value. You have a little table on the bottom right that shows you that, right? The third guest has the highest value because they end up bringing the most. Not only do they stay more than once, or not only do they bring you the most, but they stay more than once. So they're a reoccurring guest, and that adds value. You look at flow-through, and so flow-through analysis is essentially the amount that flows through the GOP and ultimately to earnings before interest and taxes. So you're looking at how much money goes through the gross operating profit. Conversion to direct channels, you have to look at which channel brings you the most people, because you can look at, if it's an OTA with a high commission, you can try to negotiate the commission. And you look at the revenue to cost ratio by marketing channel. So you look at which one is the most cost heavy or the most revenue beneficial for you. So essentially, A successful strategy is all about sustainable profit streams, right? You have to have rather than short-term revenue. So you don't want to have you don't want to generate a lot of revenue in the short run. You want to have good streams of profit for the long run. In order to do this, you can aggressively implement strategies designed to shift future bookings to cheaper channels, right? It's more profitable if people use cheaper channels than more expensive ones. You understand the target guests, why they travel, what their preferences are to better attract them. You differentiate product offerings, because if you have differentiation, it attracts people even more. They have more options. When you have more options, you tend to not only spend more, but you are more appealed to something. You customize the offers by channel. And this can also help encourage the use of certain channels, because if, for example, direct channel is the most profitable and you provide a package deal, more people might come to your direct channel, right? You must also invest into more marketing funds, into channels with the highest potential to bring ancillary revenue, because again, ancillary revenue, F&B, spa, and all that can bring a lot of money. So whichever one can bring you the most money there, think about using them more often. And you look at estimating the return on investment for each channel to see which one is the most profitable. Final point I'd like to make is the difference between cross-selling and upselling. So essentially the main idea between these two is cross-selling is when you try to add something on. So if you have a hotel check-in, you have a guest checking into the hotel and they've just reserved a room, well, if you offer them, say, a breakfast package or the club lounge package to encourage them to spend more, that is an example of a cross-sell. An upsell is if you try to make them spend more for maybe an upgrade, right? For example, you come in with a standard room and you get upsold to a suite. You spend more, you pay the difference, you get a suite, so you've actually upgraded your category, and that means that now, the standard room, there's one more availability because you upgraded, so that means you've got a bit more inventory allocation there. So often always very useful to upsell to gain that additional revenue. All right, so let me just see if we have any questions. No, am I that clear? Damn. All right, moving on to chapter 9. The overbooking policy. I will also have a Excel example to illustrate this and make it a bit clearer. We do not have anything for channel distribution. There's not really an Excel thing that we were given, but overbooking, I will show you an example of that. So overbooking, well, it's a method that is used by hotels to protect revenues from losses caused by no-shows or cancellations. Obviously, very often you have people that don't show or that they cancel, and that's a lost revenue opportunity. Right? If you have a hotel that's fully booked and someone cancels, well, you've got a free room that no one's using, and that's potential revenue lost, right? So you need to also consider the probability of the cost times the probability, but we'll look at that a bit later on. So internal approaches to this policy. Well, you have no-show forecasting. Right? You can look at how many people on average are predicted to not show, and that can help you determine how many overbooking rooms or how many rooms you want to overbook. You can also look at the overbooking policy itself. So these are internal approaches within the organization to address this. External approaches, well, you can look at deposits. Right? You make people come faster, because the whole point is you don't want people to not show up or to cancel. The whole point is every reservation you have, you want to keep. So how can you do that? Well, you can give a credit card guarantee. You can ask the guest to pay a non-refundable deposit. You can call the guest to remind them, or you can also provide them or put a condition that there's a penalty for no-show to decrease the chances or the potential revenue lost by a no-show. The main problems with overbooking is, well, if the overbooking capacity is greater than the number of no-shows, if you overbook more than the number of no-shows, so say for example, you've got 100 rooms, you predicted 10 no-shows, turns out, and you've overbooked for 10 rooms, and you've got 5 no-shows. Well, you've got 105 reservations for 100 rooms. Well, obviously, you can imagine you'd be quite angry if you had to be turned away. So those turned away would be rather angry, and they may switch to a competitor. It could also damage the company image, and the costs of overbooking are rather high. You have to look at reimbursement, you have to look at relocation and stuff. So it's important to correctly accurately predict no-shows so that you can have the right amount of overbooking rooms so that you reduce the amount of angry customers that you have. So the strategy is to minimize the opportunity cost of an empty capacity, right? The whole point is you want to have all your rooms filled. If you have an empty room, it's revenue potential lost, and that's not good for a hotel, right? You want to try to maximize revenue, not keep rooms empty. So you look to minimize the costs of guests with reservations being turned away. So you want to minimize the cost that you have. So if you have to turn someone away, spend the least money possible, which is beneficial in the long run. You minimize the expected cost in the long run, and training of employees or dealing with guests needs to be done as well, because obviously you can imagine when you are unhappy, you kind of have to learn to deal with an unhappy guest, right? Some guests may be very rude or very frustrated, so proper training can help reduce the damage of having to turn away a guest. So we have three main policies for overbooking. The main one, or the first one, is risk-based. So risk-based, or there's two subheadings, which are the critical fractal and the net result method. I'll show an Excel example of both. So the critical fractal is essentially mentioning that it's profitable to overbook as long as the complementary probability of no-show is less than the overbooking ratio. So risk-based policy is essentially looking at the economic factor. Right, risk-based policy looks at expected net gain. So here you have the net result method, which is based on the opportunity cost analysis that considers expected monetary value, cost over gain. So here you're looking at, from a cost perspective, or the revenue perspective, what is the optimal amount of rooms I should overbook. You also have service level, which essentially service level is to do with customer satisfaction. So it has nothing to do with money. It's looking at minimizing customer dissatisfaction. I'll also have an example of how to do this a bit later on. And finally, the hybrid, it's a mixture of both, where you calculate the risk-based limits, but you limit them by service level constraints. So you look, essentially a hybrid, you look to maximize revenue, right? You look to maximize or give the most amount of rooms you can overbook while keeping the most amount of guests happy. Because obviously, you want to make the most money, but you want to keep the guests happy. And this is what the hybrid function is. And we also have an example of that later on in the Excel to give you a numerical example of how to do this customer satisfaction, how to quantify it. So essentially, overbooking is the trade-off between the expected opportunity cost of idle service versus the expected cost of not honoring the reservation. In other words, it's the expected cost of leaving a room empty versus the expected cost of having to turn away a guest. Right? You have to look at the ideal balance of them. Ideally, you have the optimal overbookings, which is the number that maximizes total expected gain. While you're trying to maximize total expected gain, you want to try to minimize the amount of idle rooms you have and minimize guest dissatisfaction. In terms of formulas, well, the cost of walking a guest is essentially the cost of having too many rooms booked. Right? So this is where you have to turn away a guest. If you have 105 rooms booked for 100 guests, 105 rooms booked for 100 rooms only, well, you have to look at the cost of costing them. It includes reaccommodation, compensation, and eventually there's the loss of goodwill, right? Loss of goodwill is a long-term thing. It's not monetary, but you may lose a potential customer, right? Cost of an empty room is the profit that could have been made if the room was occupied. Essentially, well, we know from managerial accounting that, if the cost of something minus its variable costs equals a contribution margin, and the contribution margin contributes to the fixed costs. So here, if you have an empty room, well, you're not contributing to the fixed costs, and the cost of an empty room is essentially, likelihood a guest could have come back. So money you could have made is the cost of an empty room. So here again, the whole point of overbookings is the trade-off between the profit that could have been made and the cost of booking too many rooms. The working in the top right seems a little bit complicated, but it's essentially the formula we will see, I believe, on the next slide. But it essentially looks at how to quantify or how to come up with the formula to get the overbooking ratio. So essentially, if the number of no-shows is less than the number of units overbooked, the cost incurred per unit is CO. Okay, so that means if no-shows is less than the units overbooked, then the cost incurred is this, because this is the amount of empty rooms that you had. The expected cost is therefore, the expected cost is therefore this C0. If the number of no-shows is greater than the total amount of overbooked, then the revenues gained is CU, right? This is potential revenue. And these are expected revenues that is multiplied by the probability, which we'll see an Excel example later on again. So the rule of thumb is that we overbook until the expected loss on the last unit of overbooking is less than or equal to the expected revenue on the last overbooking units. I'll give again a visual representation of what exactly that means, but we must remember that total revenues are maximized when the marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost. A bit of economics there. But again, expected cost of oversale is the estimated marginal revenue for the value for the next room to be sold. So here on the bottom right, you actually see a graph of the expected revenue in terms of overbooking, and you'll see that the more you overbook, the less revenue you end up making. Reason being, the cost of reallocation is going to be greater than the potential revenue that you make. So you're actually going to end up spending a lot more, right? You're going to lose a lot of revenue. So it's about finding the optimal amount, which is the little peak of this graph here. And if you can optimize the amount of overbookings you have, it is a way to increase optimize the potential revenue that you may get. So essentially, critical fractal. Steps to look at it: to find the overbooking ratio, you find the distribution of no-shows, you calculate the cumulative probabilities, and you use the ratios to get recommended overbooking numbers. Again, I have an Excel on this, so if it doesn't make sense, we will have a visual representation. In order to find the ratio, you need the ADR, you need the variable cost, and you need the estimated cost of walking a guest, right? You need ADR and VC because that is the cost of keeping a room empty. Right, the potential profit that was made is once you deduct the variable cost, the profit is what goes to, or the contribution margin is what goes to the fixed costs. So again, the ratio is equal to the cost of walking a guest divided by the cost of walking a guest plus the cost of an empty room. And this is your overbooking ratio, which we will use in an example later on. So say, for instance, you have a ADR of 300, a variable cost of 80, and an estimated cost of walking a guest. Well, you've got estimated cost of walking a guest at 600. Well, if you were to do the working, you'd have 600 divided by 600 plus 220, which is a ratio of 0.73. We'll see an example of that a bit later on. So service level policies that limit. Well, obviously, especially if you're using the hybrid method, you have service level policies that will be a constraint. Right? So first of all, it's the probability of denial of the service and the percentage of customers who are denied of service. Again, we will look at that, but essentially these 2 points relate to the dissatisfaction of guests, right? And I have an example that looks at the service levels there that you can refer to. Finally, we have the final points that I'd like to make is to do with the binomial distribution, which is what we will use to calculate the service level policy. To calculate overbooking in relation to the service level policy. So the binomial distribution is used when there are two mutually exclusive outcomes. They are success and failure, and it is used to obtain the probability of observing X successes in N trials, and assumes that P is fixed for all trials. Again, if this doesn't make sense, I'll show you an Excel document right now so that it could provide a little bit more insight onto how you can compute this. Give me a second. Let me just... a second. I've got to open Excel. Awesome. All right. So, say for instance, you have assumed that all of this is blank, but say for instance, you have only this. Okay, you have only this. You have no shows on days of the week. Okay, and your day of the week is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Saturday, and so on. Okay, and this is data for, I believe it's 10 weeks. All right, so you've got data for 10 weeks. And how would you approach this? Well, first of all, you look at the average no-shows, right? One of the steps that I mentioned earlier is to find the distribution of no-shows. Well, which day has X amount of no-shows? And to do that, you would just take the average of, on a day of week 1, what is the average of day of week 1, and so on. Then what you do is that, you are given the average arrivals. This was given. And you have to find the percentage of no-shows, because that is how you will find the optimal booking ratio, overbooking ratio. You have to look at the probability or the percentage in relation to arrivals. How many people, out of everyone arriving, how many people will not show? So the way you do this is you just take your average no-show value and you divide it by the average arrivals that you have. Okay, and then you'll get a percentage of no-show like this. Then you look at the distribution. So to compute the distribution, once you have calculated all this, I've only done it for Monday because to save a bit of time, we have gone over time. So to save a bit of time, essentially what this table is it's showing me the frequency of no-shows for a given day. In essence, on Monday, there is not a single case where there are 0 no-shows. Likewise for 1 no-show, likewise for 2 no-shows, likewise for 3 no-shows. However, on Monday, there are 4 times where there are a total of 11 no-shows. 4 cases where there are 11 no-shows, 4 cases where there are 12 no-shows, 1 case where there's 13 and 14 no-shows respectively. And if you do the same thing, it's the count if. You can see the formula on the top, and the only thing you would change is just the day of month that you have. Essentially, it's Tuesday. You can look at the distribution. Tuesday, it's a lot more distributed. It's 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 2, 0, 1, 1. So here, we'll just take Monday for an example, right? So assume, I'm just going to show you how to do it for Monday because it's the same principle for all dates. But for the sake of saving a little bit of time, once you have found your distribution, you see it here. Well, you can start to calculate your overbooking ratio. So how would you do this? Well, assume you're given the cost of walking a guest, the cost of an empty room, and you have to calculate the critical fractal. The critical fractal is the overbooking ratio. So we use the formula. Remember the formula, which is cost of walking a guest divided by cost of walking a guest plus the cost of an empty room. And we get our critical fractal to be 73%. Okay, that is our overbooking ratio. All right? So here, on this table, we're just taking Monday as an example, but once you have found the distribution of no-shows, you can calculate the cumulative probabilities, the step that I showed you earlier on the slide. So you're looking at the occurrence. Number of no-shows is on this side. The occurrence, we know already, it's 4, 4, 1, 1, right? 4 and 11. 4 times it's 11 no-shows. 4 times it's 12. Once it's 13. Once it's 14. Then you look at the probability. So this P and S is equal to S is X is equal to is essentially saying what is the probability that my no-show is equal to this value. So you can see here that the probability of a no-show of one no-show is 0 because there hasn't been one case in the last 10 weeks of data. You can see the amount of data here. We've got 10. So it's 10 weeks of data. There's not been one case in 10 weeks of data where there has been one no-show on a Monday. Therefore, the probability of one no-show is 0. If you carry on all the way to the bottom, we saw that we have seen 4 cases where there were 11 no-shows on a Monday. Therefore, the probability of a no-show is 4 divided by 10. You can see it here. It's 4 divided by 10 is a probability. So if you were to forecast the amount of no-shows, say forecast the amount of no-shows for the next Monday, well, you can say there's a 40% chance that there are going to be 11 no-shows. When you do the same principle for 12, you see that there's also a 40% chance for 12 no-shows, and there's a 10% chance for 13 and 14. So here, you're looking at the probability that you will have a given amount of no-shows. And we see that obviously here are the 2 highest probabilities. Then what you're going to do is you're looking at the probability that the no-show is equal to or greater than X. All right, and this is where it gets a little bit tricky because apparently, according to our teacher, this is where a lot of people tend to make a simple mistake. So if you take one no-show, for example, one no-show, we have never seen it. There's not been one case where there was one no-show. Therefore, the probability of a no-show is 0. The probability of one no-show is 0. The probability of one no-show or more is 100%. Because what this is telling you is it's essentially telling you what is the probability that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on no-shows. Well, 11 is greater than 1, so therefore the probability is 100. If you scroll all the way to the bottom, you apply the same principle. Here, you must remember that this column here says greater than or equal to. So that means the probability that you have 11 or more no-shows is 100%. The reason being, well, the question is asking you, what is the probability of 11 or more? Well, 11 no-shows is equal to 11, so therefore, it's 100%. All right, I hope that makes sense. Apparently it's a very, very simple thing people will make as a mistake, but here you will see that it's 11 or more. So that's why here it's on 12 no-shows you have 60%. The reason being, well, what is the probability that you have 12 no-shows or more? Well, you have to subtract the probability of 11, because it's no longer inclusive of 11, it's inclusive of 12, 13, 14, and so on. So in this case, it's 60%. The probability to have 11 or 12 or more no-shows is 60%. And the same principle for 13. 13, you subtract that you subtract the probability of 11 and 12. So here it's 20% likely you will have 13 or more of no-shows. So how would you be able to find the amount of rooms to overbook? Well, here you can see that the probability that it's greater than or equal to, you can see already the large majority, it's going to have to be between 11 and 12, right? The highest probability is 11 and 12. You have an 80% chance that you have between 11 and 12 no-shows. So you already know that immediately it's there. And very, very rarely the probability, this, for example, here, the 60%, it's very, very, very rare it is going to be equal to the overbooking ratio, right? It's almost impossible. But what you can do is, well, we know that our critical fractile is 73%. So 73% lies between 60 and 100, right? 60 is less than 73, and 73 is less than 100. So therefore, you know that the 70% critical fractal is between these two values. However, so you know it's 11 point something, right? Because it's between 11 and 12. It's not greater than 12, it's not less than 11, it's between 11 and 12. So we must also remember, however, so essentially it says 11 point something, but we must remember that in RM, we have to remember the non-negativity constraint and the integrity constraint. Because it's between 11 and 12, essentially 11 point something something rooms, that's not an answer, because you cannot sell 0.5 of a room. You can't sell 0.6 of a room. You can't sell 0.7 of a room. So you have to sell a whole number of rooms. So in this case, because 70 relies between these two values, we're going to overbook and be conservative with 11. The reason being, well, you can book 12, but 12 is just above the critical fractal, and you want to be conservative. Because in the chance that you have, there's a greater chance that you will have 11 than you will have 12 in this respect. Because, well, if you have to turn away even one guest, the cost is much higher than if you just went with 11 to start with, right? So that's why we go with 11. We try to be conservative, and if you have an empty room, you can always find a way to sell it at a discounted rate, or be able to overbook or let a walk-in, because there's also walk-ins coming in as well, and we must remember. This column, our professor had told us not to refer to it, so don't worry that this is blank, but again, just remember that between these two, this critical fractal lays between these two. Now, looking at the service level, I know this looks quite complicated, but once it's explained, it's rather simple. So this is what I was talking about with the binomial distribution, the binom dist, all right? So assume that we are given this table and that these three columns were all blank. Overbook by acceptable risk and no-shows were all blank. These no-shows I simply got from the no-show data, okay? These values here are identical to that there, okay? I'm using the same results, I'm using the same data for the purpose of the explanation, I'm not going to calculate new probabilities. So you'll see that for day of week 6 and 7, it's 9.5 and 5.7. Here you have 9.5 and 5.7. So I've just copied and pasted the probability of no-shows. The acceptable risk. Now this value is what makes it the service level. Essentially, the acceptable risk is the amount of people you want to be dissatisfied, the amount of complaints you are going to have at a maximum, which means that if you have more than 0.001, you will not overbook. All right, so 0.001 means essentially you are going to have a maximum of 1 in 1,000 guests dissatisfied. Any more than that, you will not overbook. Any less than that, you will take the overbooking, because the probability of having an unhappy guest is lower than the maximum risk you're willing to have, right? So once you've got the acceptable risk, this is where you do the binom dist. So the binom dist, when you do binom dist, so you can do it like this. I'll show you how it is. So it's equal to binom.dist, right? Once you put this in, S, number S, is essentially going to be the number of no-shows. Number S would be this one, the probability of the no-show. All right, so that is going to be your number S. So now the number of no-shows will be here, sorry. The number of no-shows is on this column up here. So that will be what your number S is. So you're looking at the probability of the number of no-shows that you're going to get. So here you're going to click, this would be your number S. The trials will be the number of arrivals. Right? So essentially what you're going to do with this is you're going to say, well, what is in looking at the number of arrivals and the probability of a no-show, what is the probability that I'm going to get a dissatisfied guest? So essentially here your trials is the number of independent trials, right? S is the number of successes, trials is the number of trials. So how many no-shows out of the arrivals forecast? Right? Then you're looking at the probability S, which is the probability of a no-show, right? Because you can't just say what is number S out of how many no-shows out of trials. You have to also include the probability. In relation to the probability, how many no-shows am I going to get out of X amount of trials, right? And finally, the cumulative is whether you will have a true or a false. So this will be the probability that there are at most number S successes, or the probability that there are actually exactly number S. So true, if you were to do in this example here, right, you have the cumulative, which is 1. This 1 is true. So true being that you're looking up to that given point. So how would you do this? Well, in this example, let's just take the probability of a no-show on the 14th. Okay, so what did I do? So I did equals binom dist, number S, which is the number of no-shows, right? Number of no-shows in this example is 0. You see it here. Out of a trials, well, I've got 100 arrivals on the 14th. So I'm looking at 0. What is the probability? How many no-show out of complaints? 0 no-shows out of 100 arrivals. Then I put the probability in. The probability S is the probability of a no-show. And I make it how many, what is the probability that there are at most 0, I'm losing my train of thought. What is the probability that there are at most 0 no-shows in the 100 arrivals, right? So you will see here that your value is going to be very, very small. I mean, it's ridiculously puny. So it's 0.00004. So here, because your value here is less than the acceptable risk, right? You notice that here I've got 4 zeros. And here I've got 1 out of 1,000. Here, that means that on the 14th, I will overbook by 0. Now let's move it forward. Let's see it here. And on the 14th, if I have an overbooking of 1, well, I will have exactly 0.0005 out of 10,000. So this means that because this is still less than the acceptable risk, I will overbook by 1. All right, this is this is 1 out of 1,000. This is 5 out of 10,000, and 5 out of 10,000 is less than 1 out of 1,000. So therefore, you can overbook because you're not going to have as many complaints. The complaints you will receive are not exceeding the maximum amount you want to have. However, if you look on overbooking by 2, you will see that the value that is spat out by the formula is actually 0.0031. Now, this means that there will be 3.1 out of 1,000 guests that are dissatisfied. Now, this is more dissatisfied guests than you want. So therefore, you will not book 2, overbook by 2, because you will have the probability of having 3 guests. Well, you will most likely have 3.1 guests out of 1,000 complaints. So you're actually going to have more complaints than what you want. So therefore, you're not going to exceed it. All right, let's take another example in being the 20th. So over here, if you take 1 overbooking, it's still below acceptable risk. If you take 2 overbookings, it is still below acceptable risk. If you take 3 overbookings, it's still an acceptable risk, because at 3 overbookings, you've actually got 4 out of 10,000. 4 out of 10,000 is less than 1 out of 1,000. Whereas if you overbook by 4, well, you can see that on average, you're going to have 1.8 people out of 1,000 being unhappy. Now, I know you can't have 0.8 of a person, but if you extrapolate that and you'd say, say I want to do it out of 10,000, right? 1 out of 1,000 is the same as 10 out of 10,000. So here, this would actually be 18 out of 10,000, which means that it exceeds the acceptable risk. So therefore, you will not overbook. Because again, from a service level perspective, you want to try to minimize the amount of guest complaints you have. And in this example, you set a maximum complaints you will get, because otherwise, if you have too many, it tarnishes your reputation and all that. So your maximum guests unsatisfied is 1 out of 1,000. If you exceed that, you will not take the risk, because on a service level, you want to keep everyone happy. So you're going to overbook by only 2, because you're going to have significantly less people unhappy than if you overbook by any other quantity. So again, here you can see 3 more examples where, wherever it's highlighted is the amount you're going to book, because again, here in the next overbooking value will actually exceed the acceptable risk. See, here it's actually 1.3 out of 1,000, not 1. So this, because it exceeds, you will not overbook by 15, you will overbook by 14. And this is a way to be able to determine how many rooms you will overbook from a service level perspective, not directly from an economic perspective. So that brings the end to our tutoring. I know that not all classes have completed the final chapter, which is the revenue management for non-traditional. I went to our class finished it after the presentation was uploaded to the server. So if you would like me to add the final chapter, which is not Excel based, but there's a bit of theory in it. If you'd like me to add it, I can add it so that it's available for everyone